Good evening. This was not the intent to be teaching this evening, but I did have it ready. So the good and ready for us to go this evening. On the way over, Mary said, "What do we have to do this week?" And now, get ready for Wednesday night has moved a little bit higher up on the list because I'm no longer ready at all for Wednesday night since Wednesday came early. Thank you all for being here, I guess, and for allowing us to continue with our lessons that we've been talking about here for a couple of Wednesdays. Is a history of the church. And when we were together on Wednesday night, we had talked about the term, the word apostasy. And tonight, our lesson will be external causes of apostasy. So we talked about it in general. And then tonight, we will deal with external. Probably on Wednesday night, we'll deal with internal. So what's the difference between external and internal? Inside, outside. Which one's which? External is from the outside, right? And internal is from the inside. And so tonight, the best way to describe it would be the issues that arose in the early church that came from outside of the church. All right. So we're going to look, especially early, we'll have some scriptural things. And then the back end of the class, you'll see a few Roman emperors that you may have heard of, some that you may not have heard from. The other night, when I flashed up the picture of Constantine, everybody got real excited, thought he was super cute. So we'll put a few more handsome fellas up, and we'll let you make your decisions tonight, whether or not that would they rank high enough for you or not. But tonight we're going to talk about external causes. Let's start first with just a real quick recap of the other night. When we say that apostasy is the abandonment or the renunciation of religious belief. It's also political belief, but for our purposes, religious belief is the only thing that we're really concerned about. And so the question is, why did the church, as it was created, as it was formed, as it existed in the New Testament, why did it change? Well, there's no one singular answer to that question. There were lots of things that happened. It's also not a singular event that you can point to or a singular time that you can point to. It's an overlapping, it's a quilt of numerous things that sort of all start to happen over time. And Don mentioned this on Wednesday night as we were wrapping up, is that sometimes things happen really quick. And then some of the other things that we talked about happened over 4 or 5 centuries. And so it's hard to necessarily pinpoint specific things. But it included, as you can see there, modification of what we would call scriptural authority. That's the first thing. So where we used the Bible, where the church would refer back to the scriptures, that started to change. We see the adoption of other doctrines. I think we talked about 4 on Wednesday night. There were others that could have been talked about as well, but some of those things were added to, were adopted by the church. And then finally, what we talked about things on Wednesday night were the development of creeds. And we talked about the Nicene Creed. I had a picture on the side of the Nicene Creed that had, if you looked at it, probably 10 different creeds that exist or have existed as well. And so just as a quick reference to those. Now, I do want to say, just like when we talked about when we did some of our lessons this summer, I know it's Sunday night, and Sunday night's usually not for talking, but it is for talking tonight. So I'll ask questions, and if you have questions or if you have answers or if you have comments, please do not hesitate to speak. Continuing with the review, I want to ask the question, is apostasy a failure in the Lord's plan? I don't want a yes or a no as much as I want a explanation about it. So I want you to think about it for a second. Is apostasy or changing or adapting or falling away or whatever word we want to use a failure in the Lord's plans? Hey. Yeah. Okay. Others.
I think it's man's nature to want to be in charge, to have power, to be in control.
Yep.
You can't release that authority to God, so they got to make all these rules and stuff. Either elevate them so that they can change things. I think that comes into play.
That makes sense. We read some scriptures about how that even in the New Testament, there were talk that these things were going to happen. And these were scriptures that were written by apostles, words that had been said by Jesus. So it was inevitable that it would happen. And I think one of you said free will, and I think that's a good term to use, is that we have the ability to make our own decisions. We have our ability to make our own adaptations. Sometimes those could be good, sometimes they're not. And so that's really good. Yes, sir. Anyone else? Look then up here. If we're talking about religious history, we're talking about the history of the church. There have always been instances of what I've labeled up here temporary triumphs. A triumph is a win or a success or a victory, whatever word you want to have. I would imagine, as we finished on Wednesday night with the Nicene Creed, I would imagine that the Emperor Constantine was pretty happy when that had been resolved, because he was the emperor and he needed all the stuff we talked about the other night. And so that's an example of a temporary triumph. Was it necessary for the church? No, but for his sake it was. And so quite often when we think about this, we think about these temporary triumphs, whatever it might be, then that's something that maybe wasn't necessary, but in the eyes of the emperor, it probably was. All right. The third thing you see up here, the reason I had Don read from Revelation is because he's talking about the church right there. And you can see that even though there's conflict, even though there's tribulation, even though there's difficulty, there was a brighter day ahead. And that's, I think, the next to last chapter in the Bible that Don read from this evening. So at the very end, there is a positive look, but it was never promised to be easy along the way. Now, we're going to look at two different types of external causes of apostasy this evening. The first kind we're going to deal with is Jewish persecution, and then the second kind is Roman persecution. We talk about Jewish, we'll talk about Judaism being a religion, but also Judaism being a race or a nation of people. And then, of course, Rome will be more political than it will be than it would be religious, although there are religious reasons that Rome had issues. So let's start here at the first part. So the early church was almost exclusively Jewish, tied to the Jewish faith. And those Jewish people that had followed Jesus, because Jesus was Jewish, his apostles were Jewish. He went into synagogues. They went into synagogues and taught and preached. And so that was going to be a lot of their converts. However, not all Jewish people followed Jesus. Not all Jewish people accepted Jesus. And so those who rejected it, and you can see it right there, were in many cases bitterly opposed to those that accepted. Why would some Jewish people have been opposed that other Jewish people accepted Jesus? All right, so it was perhaps a betrayal. That works. What else? Okay, makes sense. A dilution of beliefs from pulling from the pool of people. What else? It certainly was a change. And the idea that Jesus was a Messiah, that he was a savior, but he was a savior for God's chosen people. Well, who were God's chosen people? The Jews. But if you didn't accept that, if they didn't accept him as being that Messiah, then why would others accept that? And so there's a divide there between the two. Now, the second thing that you see right there is that the Jewish faith obviously viewed Christianity as a rival. A Christian rival is two different groups that split apart. And you talk about rivalries with, teams or rivalries with people. Well, there was a rivalry perhaps in the faith because they shared this common heritage. There was so much about them that were alike. We talk about this sometimes at school, like the team that we want to beat the most. And they're all rednecks and they're all crazy and they're all, all this kind of stuff. And they literally live 7 miles from you. They're the exact same people, all right? But you all know exactly what I'm talking about, right? There's that group of, the Jewish people and the Christian people had this rivalry, but they were actually kind of what Ben said. They were the same pool of people. They had a common heritage. There were former members. Think about it this way. There were people that went from over here and they just went and sat on this side as a way for us to sort of think about it.
Islam, Jews, and Christians.
Mm-hmm.
The same God, all the way up to Abraham.
Sure. Sure.
But you would think that we should have at least that much in common. There would be some ground to talk to one another.
Right.
Be friendly.
Right. The person that you have so much in common with, you butt heads with them maybe more than the person who's, like you said, halfway around the world. Right there. Then we also have the third part here, and we saw this in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 2. There was also this realization that if Christianity were true, and I use the word Christianity, maybe I should say if Christ really were the Messiah, maybe that's the better word to use right there, then they were guilty of the murder of. And there's been times when I've made mistakes, or I think I've made mistakes, and that weighs on me a little bit as well. I don't know if this is a mistake or not, but have I done right? Have I done wrong? That becomes an issue. So those are some external causes. Now, these persecuted Jewish people have been predicted. We're going to read a few things right here. There's two. Let's look at the top one, which is Mark chapter 13 and verse 9. Mark chapter 13 and verse 9. Kevin, do you care to read the first one there? So this is Jesus talking, but this is an example of persecution by Jewish leaders. It says, watch out for yourselves. Obviously, they'll deliver you up to councils. What was the Jewish council, the highest council? The Sanhedrin, all right. You'll be beaten in the synagogues. Where did Jewish people worship? Synagogue, all right. You'll be brought before rulers and kings for my sake to offer a testimony to them. We'll see that here in a little bit. We're talking about Stephen, and we'll see an example of that. Let's drop down to the bottom. This is Matthew 10, verses 16 through 18. Jimmy, do you care to read that one? So on the back half, this looks real similar to what's said also chapter 13. But the first part, Jesus says, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Describe that for me. What does that mean, sheep in the midst of wolves? You'll be eaten alive. You'll be slaughtered. You are not walking into a safe place. We'll put it that way. And so Jesus is warning them that that's what they'd be going into. So he said, therefore, be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. Let's talk about both of those for a second. Wise as a serpent, wise as a snake. What do you think that meant? Sure. Yes. Sure. Mm-hmm. You had to be aware of their surroundings. So to be smart, be wise. But then the second part says, be then harmless, because a snake, in a manner that a snake allows itself to protect itself, if you walk past the snake, if you're walking down a trail and there's a rattlesnake coiled up right there beside, if you're a little too close to it, what will it do? It'll bite out at you. Its job is to eliminate you, to get you out of the way. But that's not what we see here. They're harmless as doves. I think what Jesus is saying there is go out into amongst the people, there will be this real desire to sort of beat people over the head with the scriptures, to make them do it. That's not necessarily going to be the most effective approach. To be harmless, you also have to be aware of what you are facing. Let's go to John 15, verses 18 through 20. Josh, you care to read this one? So especially the back half, verse 20 of this right here, when Jesus says, if they treated me poorly, you should be expected to get treated poorly as well, because they are persecuting the word in and of the same. They're persecuting what Jesus, nobody was the other than what Jesus taught here in John chapter 15. Now, there's some various stages where we see it. Let's go to the first one, which is the early stages. We're going to look at 4 things here right now. This is the early stages of persecution. This is Acts chapter 5, verse 17, and then verse 33. I just kind of jumped ahead, so you'll see the three periods there. That's when we jump to verse 33. Shelby, care to read this? So when we see here, this is an example of the high priest, which was Jewish, looking to try and eliminate any kind of threat, right? Looking to eliminate a threat. This is Stephen. This is Acts chapter 6, verses 8 through 15. Ben, I'm going to have you read this, and it goes to the second page here. So.
Alexandria and those from Cilicia and Asia, and they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke. Words against Moses, and they stirred up the people and the elders and the scribes. And they came upon him and seized him and brought him to the council. They also set up false witnesses. This man does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. We have heard him say this, that this Jesus of Nazareth was destroyed saw his face.
Story of Stephen, and we'll come back to it in just a second with the next set of verses. But he was a preacher, a teacher, right? We know this story of him. And it says then here, there arose some from what's called the synagogue of freedmen. So this is exactly what had just been talked about, right? That there would be people from a synagogue who would argue back with what had been taught. Well, Stephen was a Christian. He was a follower of Jesus. And so they weren't really able to figure out what to blame him with, but they said, and they secretly induced men, meaning they sort of said, maybe a bribe might have been there, or some other form of secret. It says, we've heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God. Okay? Now, do you notice anywhere in here where they actually say an exact thing that he said? No, but they said, we've heard him say, I heard him say this, right? Well, maybe that's a little hearsay. Maybe they're just making it up. But that's a good way to sort of get somebody out of the picture. And then it says they stirred up the people. And they all come in and they say, well, he does not seek to speak blasphemous words. So I don't see anybody that asks what blasphemous words were that were spoken. But he said, well, he just keeps saying all of this. What were they trying to do to Stephen? Say it again. Railroading. Yeah, that's good. What else? In an ideal world, would Stephen be preaching tomorrow if they could do this to him today? You're trying to eliminate him, right? They want to get rid of him, and they'll do that to others as well. Now, this is where the actual, we go a little further, one chapter over. This is Acts chapter 7. Mel, do you care to read this? And it's just like Ben, it flips over to the second page. We didn't have all the time to read all of chapter 7, but I would encourage you to go back and read Acts chapter 7 because it's Stephen's defense of himself. And he speaks for about 60 verses, 60 verses, I guess, about all the things that have been done wrong. But what Mel read here at the very end was, as he's almost finished, what is the Jewish crowd's opinion of him? They hate him, right? And so they're gnashing their teeth, right? That they're angry with him for what he was teaching. But he was only teaching what Jesus had taught. And he finishes at the end by saying something that I doubt any of us would have said. What did Stephen say at the very end? Don't charge them with this. Every one of us would have said, charge every one of them. They all ought to be in trouble for this. And so his approach was certainly one. But that's an example of persecution by religious leaders. We see another one in the death of James. This is Acts chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Annette, do you care to read Acts 12, verse 1 and 2 up here? All right, so we see an example here of somebody being killed, and it's in the same verse or in the same collection of verses there to harass some from the church. That was exactly what Jesus had said. The third thing, persecutions by Paul. You may have noticed that when Melvina was reading a minute ago, it said that they laid the coats when they stoned Stephen at the feet of who? Of Saul, who will be Paul a little bit later on. But Paul was involved in this quite a bit as well. This is Acts chapter 26, verses 9 through 11. Lucille, do you care to read this one? So this is Paul of his previous life, as you would say, as he was Saul, but all of the things that he had done. He said he thought that he should do many things contrary to the name of Jesus. What does he mean when he says that? Against. What is contrary? An opposition. Good. We use the word contrary. We use the word contrast. If you compare, then you contrast with things that are different. And he said his thought was, I have to do anything that's opposite of what Jesus taught. So essentially, if Jesus said it's blue, Paul said it should be what? Red, right? If Jesus said go, Paul said stop. It was almost like he sought out an opportunity to teach things contrary. And it shows that he did all of these things. And he said he received authority from where? From the chief priest. So a renegade Paul just being a jerk, but he was doing things under the supervision of the religious leaders. And he said, when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. So when they brought up a person and said, should this person die? Paul says, yes, or Saul was saying, yes, that he should. He punished them in every synagogue. He compelled them to blaspheme, and he, being exceedingly enraged against them, he said, I even went to foreign cities. It was almost like I can't do enough here. I want to go other places and harass Christians as well. Paul will be on the other side of that here in a second. Josh, go ahead. I don't know. It would be an interesting question to think. So I would think no, just based on, I feel like that would have come out as well. And it's not in the scriptures, but it'd be a hard question to answer perfectly as well. The last one then is Jewish persecution, religious persecution of Paul and the other apostles. This is 1 Corinthians, should be. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 4, 9, and then 11 through 13. Don, do you care to read that one?
labor working with their hands, being reviled and blessed, being persecuted and endured, being detained and being treated. We have been made as the filth of the earth, the offscouring of all things until now.
So this is Paul on the opposite side of it. As a apostle, as a preacher, as a teacher, the treatment that he had faced along with many of the others as well. These are just some examples of persecution that early Christian, mostly teachers more than people, early Christians faced against their former religious friends, I guess you would say. I don't know how you would best describe it. People that they used to be of the same religious belief with. And so it was certainly an era of conflict. And I wanted to look at all of these because every single one of these are examples that we can pull up in the scripture of people being treated poorly. Yes, sir. Yes. Right. Quite often, and it probably has a lot to do with where we live. It's certainly not the most diverse area that you will be in compared to some other places. But quite often, your experiences talking with people about religion, you probably share a good portion of your beliefs. You probably share a pretty similar set of beliefs. And as Don was saying right there, if your approach is to just be, just kill it right from the get-go, you're going to drive those folks away. The early Christians and the Jews shared almost all beliefs, with the exception of, was Jesus the Savior? Now, that's a pretty big thing. I don't mean to say that, but there were a lot of cultural similarities. There were a lot of religious similarities that these people shared, but they didn't necessarily handle it in an appropriate manner. Other thoughts? Could have been. All right. Now, we kind of leave the Bible there, and we're going to look now going forward for the rest of our time tonight at Roman persecution. Now, Rome was the overarching dominant political entity of the time, and the people that lived in Jerusalem, the people in Israel, the people of Jesus's family and friends were all under the governance of the Roman Empire. And it was ruled by men, but it was also kind of ruled by the army. They had emperors, but you had to do what you were supposed to do, or you wouldn't be the emperor very long. And so there was this sort of dual setup there. Most of the emperors fell into some descriptions that we have right here. They would be described as cruel. They could be described as wicked. They could be described as extravagant. I'll let you fill in the blanks as what those words are. How many of those would you say are positive words? Probably not many, especially the cruel and wicked. Extravagant could be in certain cases, but extravagance was mostly extravagance for themselves. They wanted the power, they wanted the glory for themselves. The population of Rome could be broken down, and I say Rome, I don't necessarily mean the city, but the empire, could be broken down into three groups: the wealthy group, the slave group, and then a middle class of free citizens. I think Paul fell into that middle class of free citizens, which got him out of some trouble a few times there as well. But the population was large. They covered a lot of different areas. If you look at this map here, this is a map of the Roman Empire. Everything that's yellow is the Roman Empire during the first century. So let's just call it the time of Jesus. It may not be perfect. They may have gained some of this land after Jesus had already died. These are first century churches. Everywhere you see a cross, there was a church. I'm sure there were more, but these are examples of first century churches. The town should look familiar. Philippi. What letter was written to Philippi? Philippians. What about Thessalonica? We have the Romans, Corinthians, Ephesians, All right, we have several here. Then we also have a few over here on the far side. The country of Georgia over here in Armenia and Babylon. They're on the edges here. You'll notice they have a cross, but there's also a question mark. There's some debate as to whether the church existed in those places or not. But these blue lines were the movement of the church. And we talked about it the other night, how there were sort of 5 primary cities. Well, all of these lines are moving away from those cities and going to other places. And so the church spread from the larger cities out to the smaller, more rural areas as well. Now, I told you we were going to look at pictures of of Roman emperors. To start with, these first 2, in the lifetime of the apostles, and the other night we said the lifetime of the apostles about to 100 AD. These were the 2 main waves of persecution. And some were worse, some were better. But first, the one on the left-hand side is the Emperor Nero. All right, he ruled from 65 to 63 to 68 AD. He's the one who we talked about on Wednesday night. They blamed the Christians when the fire burned much of the city on the Nero and Domitian. But notice there's a gap there. Notice there's a little bit of time between one and the other. Other people filled that void, and not all emperors were as bad or cruel, wicked, extravagant, whatever word we want to use as thee. Now, here's an example of the persecution against the early church. About 111 AD. It's almost unfathomable that those dates even exist. That seems like a long time ago. I guess it was. This man right here, his name was Pliny. He was the governor of Bithynia. Bithynia is right here. It's on the northern top of Turkey. How many of you have read in the Bible or have heard mentioned in the Bible the churches of Asia? How many of you have heard of Asia Minor? That's this, okay? So we wrote a letter to the emperor, at this time it's Trajan, calling an attention to problems in his district of increasing numbers of Christians. Why might it be a problem for him if there are increasing numbers of Christians? Why might he consider this a problem? They could become right. Absolutely. We'll see that here in just a second. Tom, I'm sorry. Okay. He called Christianity in his letter, and all these letters still exist, by the way, but he called Christianity a superstition and expressed concern because so many people converting caused the Roman temples to be forsaken. People weren't coming. People weren't wanting to put money up to help keep them going or whatever. And so he asked for instructions on how to treat Christians. It's a valid answer. This is the governor of Kentucky asking the president of the U.S. how to handle a situation. The same kind of thing right here. This is Trajan. Trajan replied that the Christians were to be left alone unless they were prosecuted by accusers who would give up their names. So essentially, unless they're doing something that breaks the law, leave them alone. All right? It's not going to be that big of a problem. Okay? If convicted, they were to be given the opportunity then to renounce their faith. So if they are going against Rome, then he said, if you find them guilty, they can still say, I'm sorry, I will change. So his immediate thought is not to even kill them necessarily there as well. If they refused, then that's where the punishment would come in. Now, here's where the problem is. This seems lenient, but what it really did was it led to the same thing that happened with Stephen. It led to people coming up with any number of excuses, any number of reasons to say, she has done this, I'm saying that she's done it, and that could get her punished there as well. And so this is an example of the type of problems that early Christians faced. Thoughts on this? We got a few others as well before we finish, but how difficult do you think it would have been to have lived in a place like this?
Especially if you had any kind of possessions at all, and they would refuse you.
Sure.
They go over your land, your house,
Uh-huh.
whatever.
Absolutely. Others? Yeah. Right. Sure. I mean, yeah, the source can be, different, but the action's very similar in a lot of cases. Let's go a little further. We got a couple more I want to hit on here. This curly-haired fellow is Marcus Aurelius, and he was emperor for about 20 years, 161 to 180 AD. He is described as a just and virtuous ruler. That's good. It seems like a positive, but also an extreme persecutor of Christians. I'm going to guess that the Christians probably didn't call him a just and virtuous ruler, but nonetheless, that's how he would be described. And he was, and Ben mentioned this a minute ago, and you'll see it a couple of times, to restore the ancient religious practices and the old Roman way of life by suppressing Christianity. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but here's an example of a ruler who wanted to slow down Christianity. We have another here as well. It's a little smaller. I had to make it all fit, but this is Diocletian in 303 AD. Probably, from what I've read, the most formidable, the most systematic, the one with the best plan for killing or eliminating Christians. But he comes in following a 40-year period of church growth. The church had grown in many cases because they were allowed to grow. One of the things that they started doing was they started making church buildings. Think about this, okay? We call this the church. It's just a building, but some of the earliest church buildings were built during the late 2nd and early 3rd century in Rome. Where had churches met in the earliest days of Christianity? Where did the New Testament churches meet? They met house to house. They met we'll see it in a second. I'll give it away here in just a second. But they had built new buildings. The church was growing, and there's no need for a building unless you have what? You got to have a congregation. If it's just me and Ben, we probably don't need to go out and build a whole big new tabernacle, right? But if there's 40 or 50 or 100 of us, my house ain't going to be able to hold everybody. And so there was growth. But he was determined that he wanted to exterminate. He wanted to get rid of Christianity and reinstate the ancient system of worship. That's the same. Marcus Aurelius had said it 120 years ago. By the way, the same thing happens today. And people look back and say, well, we need to make it back like it used to be. We still see that in politics as well. And that's not always a positive either. But he comes up with a series of things. First, every copy of the Bible should be burned. Okay. When I say copy of the Bible, they had sort of bound up scriptures. They don't have it the way we did, but any scriptures that was used needed to be burned. Okay. Why do you burn scriptures? To get rid of them. Okay. It's going to be complicated for them. Second, all churches should be torn down. So all the buildings that have been built, tear them down. Why do you tear down the churches? Nowhere to meet, right? Nowhere to meet. Number 3, all who would not renounce Christianity should lose their citizenship and any outside protection of the law. Now, why would you want to maintain citizenship in the country that you live in? Sure.
And including a lot of protections like not being able to be flogged.
Sure.
Without a trial.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so the rights and privileges that existed for one group of people would then not exist for you if you were removed from that. So when we say it's systematic, he's one of the first ones that comes up with like a legit plan of how to eliminate Christianity. In some places where Christians were assembled for worship, church buildings were then set on fire with worshipers inside as well, which is a form of method. They use that. That's in the movie The Patriot. Totally inaccurate. Never happened in America at all. But it's a play on these old Roman things. But this is an example of where it did happen. Finally, we talked about the Emperor Constantine the other night. And ease from these persecutions came from Constantine. He came in 313 AD, and he issued what's called the edict. Edict is another word for law of toleration, and it sanctioned Christianity, made worship lawful, and ceased all persecution. If you've noticed tonight, every one of these that I've given, Christianity was here, and it was here, and it was here, and it was here. It was very unsettled, and it depended on who was in charge as to whether or not they believed that Christianity was a threat or it wasn't. Okay? And it was a personal threat in some cases for some emperors and not others. I want to look tonight 9 things that I want to just go through as reasons for persecution, and then we'll wrap up because we're almost finished. But 9 different things. Okay? First, Rome recognized a multitude of gods. Okay? Christians opposed all worship except to one God. So that's one reason for persecution. Number two, idol worship was interwoven throughout the Roman way of life. But Christians didn't want to offer sacrifices to false gods. You remember when Paul, right? Paul was at the Areopagus in Athens, right? And they had all kinds of gods. They had statues or idols to the unknown God there as well. And he said, he kind of called them out on it right there. But worship involved lots of gods. Christianity was different from that. Number three, emperor worship. Ben mentioned this at the beginning. Emperor worship was required by all. But Christians didn't want to bow down to an emperor, so that makes you not loyal to Rome. We have to be careful about that today. Number four, after the destruction of Jerusalem, Jerusalem falls in the late first century, in 70 AD. After the destruction of Jerusalem, Christianity then becomes identified as sort of this fanatical group. Right? They had attacked Jerusalem, they had destroyed it, and so Christianity then was a group that could be, they were a group of crazy folks maybe, and that was part of persecution. Number five, Christians met originally caves, catacombs, and that aroused suspicion. Why are they meeting in those places? If somebody called you tonight and said, we had church tonight at Mammoth Cave, we'd probably say, well, that's a little odd, right? There's a cave on the back of somebody's farm, and they said, we had church back in that cave on the back of the farm. We'd probably say, well, I mean, I get Mammoth Cave, tourist spot. That seems a little strange as well. So it offered an opportunity for people to get kind of, oh, they must be up to no good kind of thing. There were rumors that spread as a result. Go ahead. What, Josh? Yeah, it kind of led to that. Number six, we see here, Christianity looked upon people as equal, right? We go back, we looked at the elders, and we looked at this, the people that were elders in the church. We looked at the early Christians. They met together. They sold everything and lived together. Well, when they did that, there's no hierarchy of people there. And so that was quite different from the Roman world. A few more things, three more here. Ben actually mentioned this on Wednesday night, but business interests, those kind of things. People that sold idols. We read about this in I think it was Diana, right? They were selling the idol to Diana, and the guy's like, I'm out of business. You're taking all of my business from me there as well. Number eight, we talked about superstition there a minute ago. Superstition, Nero did it in 64 AD with the fire. They blamed Christians. So anytime there was a famine, it's the Christians' fault. Anytime there was disease, it's the Christians' fault. Anytime there was a plague, it's the Christians' fault. Well, that's because they were a small minority of people, and the larger group blamed them as a result of it. Same thing still happens today. Number nine, the concept of faith is probably the last one. Faith is not easily proven. If it could be proven, it can't be called faith. Faith is something that you have that you are hoping for, right? It's the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. But that's antithetical to the idea of almost everything else that we come across in life, right? This is a shirt because I can see it's a shirt. I can go to where this shirt was made. But faith is a challenge because I can't prove that God is real. If somebody said, prove God is real, how would you prove it? Scientifically, how would you prove it? You can't, right? Because that's what faith is. We have faith that it is, but faith struggles with proof. And that was a problem with the Roman government, that they had literal proof that the God was right there, that was the emperor, right? The emperor was who we worship, and he's literally right here. You're choosing to worship somebody who does not, we don't see that person. So that was a challenge that was presented as well. All of these are 9 reasons for persecution of early Christians. There were more, and some of these are probably bigger problems than others, but these are just examples of persecution. Let's finish up. Obviously, some Christians would have lacked the courage. I don't blame them. I would have had a hard time with this as well. And some of them renounced their faith. On the flip side, some Christians held their faith, but there's a lot of dead ones as a result of it. And so that's an example of persecution. But those are all external causes of apostasy. 2 minutes over. Questions? No questions? All right.